We begin this news hour in Washington, where 1 year ago today, Americans and the world were left shocked and horrified after hundreds of people stormed the U.S. Capitol building, spurred on by Donald Trump's false claims that he had won the 2020 election. Hundreds of Mr. Trump's supporters ransacked the Capitol building as they attempted to stop Congress certifying Joe Biden's election win. 5 people died, including a police officer. More than 700 have now been arrested, and a congressional inquiry is underway. The physical damage done to America's seat of democracy has been repaired, but what happened on January the 6th, 2021 remains a divisive stain on the nation. In a speech delivered at Statuary Hall, a section of the Capitol complex that was breached by the mob, President Biden laid the blame for the riot squarely at the door of his predecessor.
For the first time in our history, a president had not just lost an election, he tried to prevent the peaceful transfer of power as a violent mob breached the Capitol. But they failed. They failed. And on this day of remembrance, we must make sure that such attack never happens again. We are a great nation. My fellow Americans, in life there's truth, and tragically there are lies. Lies conceived and spread for profit and power. We must be absolutely clear about what is true and what is a lie. And here's the truth. The former President of the United States of America has created and spread a web of lies about the 2020 election. He's done so because he values power over principle, because he sees his own interest as more important than his country's interest, than America's interest. And because his bruised ego matters more to him than our democracy or our Constitution, he can't accept he lost.
President Biden. Well, for more on the deadly Capitol riot and how the events of January the 6th last year have shaped U.S. politics since, I'm joined now by Arise correspondent Philip Crowther, who is live outside the Capitol building, and by Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham, who is also in Washington. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let me come to you first of all, Philip. President Biden, as we heard there, speaking in Washington about what happened, in fact speaking in the Capitol building about what happened on January the 6th last year, he said the pains and scars from the day run deep. We are in a battle for the soul of America, he said. What's your analysis of that barnstorming speech?
Well, tell you what, this was a speech from President Joe Biden that was more aggressive, more forceful toward his predecessor than we had expected beforehand. The White House had already told us that there were going to be plenty of mentions of the former president. Again, he was not mentioned by name, by the way, by Joe Biden. That's something that he tends to do. But this was aggressive toward Donald Trump, holding him responsible not just for the attack on the Capitol in the first place exactly 1 year ago, but also for the reasons why it happened, for spreading what has become known as the big lie. That lie being this presumption on behalf of Donald Trump and his supporters that he won the election in November of 2020 and that Joe Biden lost it, that there was massive fraud, which has been proven not to be the case at all. Joe Biden also seeing Donald Trump as someone responsible for spreading those lies further still during this last year. His was also an attack on Republican lawmakers who have been siding with Donald Trump. Remember that those who have criticized the former president over the last year and see him as responsible for this insurrection, those Republicans, members of Congress, have pretty much been ostracized from the party, from those Republicans who control the party right now here in Congress. So the speech from Joe Biden, much more aggressive than we were expecting, much more forceful, and one that will be be remembered not necessarily for being a tribute to the police officers, though that was mentioned, of course, by both him and Vice President Kamala Harris. It'll be remembered more for his aggressive stance toward his predecessor. Remember that presidents don't tend to criticize their predecessors. It's an unwritten rule in US politics that was broken here today by Joe Biden.
And let's come to you, Eric Ham. We know from what we heard Philip saying there, and obviously watching the speech, that President Biden is saying that Donald Trump holds singular responsibility for the carnage and chaos of last year. Is there general consensus in America on that, or does it depend on who you ask?
Well, it certainly does depend on who you ask. But of course, what we're seeing play out right now in Washington is that many who actually look at this from a perspective of neither Republican or Democrat certainly see former President Donald Trump as the culprit for what took place. In fact, if you go to what the former speaker, the former Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell said, I mean, he actually laid this at the feet of the former president. In fact, so too did the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, before attempting to try to get back in the former president's good graces. So there is little room for doubt that President Trump is certainly the culprit of that fateful day in terms of what took place. But what we're seeing now is an attempt by the former president as well as his acolytes to try to reshape history. But of course, what we saw from President Biden today is an unwillingness to actually try to reshape that history and go back and change what happened. And I think it speaks to just how damaging January 6th was, because as Philip said, it is an unwritten rule that current occupants of the White House do not criticize their predecessors. But what we saw from the speech today was a president who went after the former president in ways that we have never seen before. And it's interesting that that happened, because normally we will get a full readout of the president's remarks leading up to his delivery of such a speech, but we only got a very small snippet of what the president was actually going to say. And now we see why, because clearly he went after the former president, and he did so with both barrels.
And Philip, just taking up from there, I mean, listening to America's leader essentially going for his predecessor, would you say that there's still quite a bit of angst in America and this deep division between the two sides that has still not been put to rest and could well be there for many years to come?
Yeah, well, don't look for consensus or solidarity anywhere around here, around Capitol Hill. There simply isn't any. In fact, the political divisions in the United States have become worse since this insurrection on the 6th of January of last year. Since then, there have been more Republicans who have essentially normalized what happened here, some even talking about this looking like tourists entering the U.S. Congress one day. There are a lot of Republican members of Congress who are very much listening to what the former president is telling them to say. There are many who seem to believe the lie that Donald Trump could have won the election in November of 2020. So there is not that solidarity that you might have seen after 9/11. Now, that is a comparison that some would reject right now, but many in the United States are saying that is a comparison that should be made, because there was this political solidarity after 9/11 in 2001 when Republicans and Democrats stood together literally on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. That is something that has not happened here in the United States over this last year. Political divisions have become worse, and there is that fear that they will become worse still. That was one of the messages from President Joe Biden during his speech here in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol, that message being that this could happen again. And the question asked by the current president was also whether this is a country that will accept political violence as the norm in the future. That is a question that currently does not have an answer.
And Eric Ham, I mean, it's interesting that many Republicans feel that the insurrection actually began in the summer of 2020, 8 months before the January the 6th. And that was when, according to them, American cities were burned by leftists and activists, and statues were being toppled. I mean, what's your assessment of that?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, when Congress was beginning to look at actually organizing a commission that would do an investigation on January 6th, what we saw from Republicans was they wanted to see the protests and demonstrations in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. They wanted to see those events also investigated. They wanted to see a deep dive into Antifa, these anti-fascist movements that many attempted to try to put the blame on for January 6th. But what we saw was, while one side attempted to try to conflate the two, what we saw from the other side, of course, was a more laser-like focus on what took place on January 6th, why it happened, but also looking at the president's rally leading up to that attack on the Capitol as to why it happened. And going back to something that Philip also mentioned, because, of course, many look back to either Pearl Harbor or to 9/11 and how the country responded. And I think that gives us a sense of just how divided the nation is today, because in the aftermath of this attack, the first that we saw such an attack on the U.S. Capitol in its history, we see that there was still a very much divided landscape politically, and that has continued to be the driving force in our politics. And right now, what we're seeing is two sides not trying to come together at all. And of course, President Biden's administration coming into view, coming into focus amid the backdrop of this horrendous violence that took place at the U.S. Capitol, while also the country was reeling from a deadly pandemic that also had taken the lives of 400,000 people at that time.
Right.
So we're looking at a very moment in our history right now, and a president trying to govern in that process.
Okay, please stay with us, Eric. I want to thank you very much indeed, Philip Crowther, Arise correspondent, who's outside the Capitol building there. Philip has got to run, but Eric, please stay with us, because I want to ask you a couple more questions. I mean, there appears amongst Republicans to be this deep-seated anger and feeling that the two sides were treated so differently, just following up on what you were saying there, and the right of the political divide, implying that there was more leniency for the Black Lives Matter protesters, for instance, and the demonstrators at the Capitol on January the 6th.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, we have seen from some members of Congress on the right, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene comes to mind, who actually has called many of these insurrectionists that have been tried, that have been convicted. She's actually likened them to political prisoners who have been held without food, without water, akin to Al-Qaeda operatives that are being held in Guantanamo Bay. That's how they have been referred to. And we have seen over and over members of Congress actually referring to the events that took place on January 6th as similar to a tourist coming to Washington to actually view the Capitol. Again, an attempt to try to whitewash the narrative, whitewash history, which is something very similar that we're seeing play out right now, where you see states actually attempting to try to reshape history by banning books that talk about slavery or the history of Africans coming to this country. And so that's playing out. And also, all of this is politicizing and polarizing the nation, driving deeper wedges across the country, depending on what side of the aisle that you're on. In fact, what we're seeing from recent polling data, it shows that many people, especially on the right, actually believe that political activism leading to violence actually is seen as a viable option when attempting to try to reshape our politics, reshape our government, that violence is actually a means to do so and should be accepted. And that is what the president spoke to today.
And Eric, many of those who stormed the Capitol building a year ago were followers of the QAnon conspiracy theory, which was which saw Donald Trump as a hero who would defeat a Satan-worshipping global cabal. And despite the lack of any evidence and the fact that QAnon's many predictions never came true, millions of Americans continue to believe that rather ghoulish story, don't they?
That's absolutely right, Charles. And it's actually one of the things that continues to confound our politics is that the conspiracies and the theories become wilder, wackier, and crazier. And in fact, what you look at, particularly with the former president, while many look to him as their guide, as their beacon, even he has seen moments where his followers have booed him. His followers have shown a lack of distrust or distaste or disdain, in fact, for some of the things that he has said and done. In fact, former President Donald Trump has actually pushed for vaccinations and called on people to get vaccinated. In fact, at a recent rally where he said that he was actually vaccinated and had received a booster shot, the audience actually booed him. And so there is still this backlash that we're seeing, even for those that the president has brought along on this journey. And now we're seeing some of the backlash because even their president, their leader, is someone who refused to go as far as, in fact, they will.
Eric, thanks very much indeed. Eric Ham, Arise US correspondent, talking to me there from Washington. And also thanks to Arise correspondent Philip Crowther, who was live outside the Capitol building.